So everything from a full textbook to a resource maybe that is 2 minutes long in length, that's a video. These are all possible under OER license. One thing that's important to keep in mind, and this is something that I've heard over and over again, I'm sure you've heard it as well, is that although the nature of OER, of course, is to be free in terms of licensing fees, there are a lot of costs involved. There's the human capacity to be able to take a resource and display it, whether it's through a learning management system or some other tool to bring that to the students. There's the need for someone to be able to manipulate or revise that tool. Typically, this takes place in the form of a team, which Barbara will talk specifically about, of people who bring various talents into play. And so it's important to remember that what an open license is just a set of uses. And that's a really important distinction to make. So something that may be free may not be open. When we're talking about OER, there's that special intellectual property license, as we've mentioned. And what's important here is the repurposing feature. A lot of times we may find something online and there's really not much we can do with that. The iterative process that is a great part of blended learning or online learning is really, I think, living within OER, which are meant to be used as needed, when needed, and for specific purposes as seen fit by the people who are going to be using it for those particular students. It's also a great way to get students involved in determining their needs and what fits best for them. I'm sure you've seen these before. When we're talking about OER, there are really a lot of different ways to think about how it could be used. The license that's in place can sometimes determine what we can do with it, and so it's important to be aware of that. Fortunately, the licensing is clearly worded, and it will always give you a really good sense of what's possible, whether it's just sharing that particular resource with others, or taking that and putting another resource together with it, and then being able to control it from your perspective as an educator as well, if you'd like to use that again. Here's a continuum and spectrum of the open licenses and where they can go in terms of being able to use them and what rights may be reserved. And so if you have not already been looking at OER, you'll get really used to seeing these different icons and what they mean. And so it's important to, as you go through the process, take a look at what's there. Even at this point, I know when we're looking for images at my school, a lot of times we'll remind the students to make sure that they understand what license has been attributed to a particular image, and just start the conversation of who owns these materials. And so here we can also see along a spectrum what these different Creative Commons licenses can stand for. So one of the things to think about is what you need and what you're trying to accomplish with your OER. In some cases, there's a need to replace an entire textbook, whether that's for budgeting reasons or simply that the instructional materials list permits that, and it's something that your school or district has been wanting to try. We know of cases where a group of teachers, perhaps on a team, have decided to take one chapter of a textbook each year and in turn use OER to remake that. And so they might need something that's more accommodating so that they can really turn that into a powerful learning tool for their needs. We'll talk just a little bit about the background research on a state level to set the stage for what Barbara is going to be discussing about Washington State. I'll tell you a little bit about the project itself and where this information comes from, just so you can have a little bit of perspective about it. The research that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes represents a 2014 initiative that was designed to explore the state of development and dissemination of OER. CCSSO conducted a survey of all 50 states in May 2014, and produced a report titled State of the States, OER in K12 Education, which highlighted examples of ongoing OER work at that time. We updated that report in 2015, and then as a follow-up, expanded the focus of the project to include districts and educators who were working closely with OER. And so very briefly, we can talk about the numbers that we see here. We wanted to know what states were doing in terms of using OER. And so we can see here by the numbers that a lot of states wanted to curate. We're not necessarily looking to create their own OER, but wanted to take what was available and make it easy for educators in their state to find, access, and use. We can see also that use and promotion of OER was a very common answer. States wanted to use OER, were perhaps not quite ready to plan an OER initiative, but were interested in promoting the idea to the educators in their state. And then we can see that 18 states were actually sharing OER materials. So you can think of your state, even at a district level, and where you might fall into line with these goals. Additionally, we know that OER can be used for very many different purposes. It can be as simple as creating a list of approved OER that can be used within a district setting or at a state level, or all the way down to a full replacement for a traditional textbook or workbook. So along that spectrum, there are a lot of different options, and as an educator, that would be something that would be important to consider when you want to use OER. If you're just getting started, you might be looking for something that would supplement your instructional materials. You can see here there were several states who wanted to actually develop their own OER as well. And then finally, in terms of what states want in an OER initiative, I think a lot of this applies to educators as well as at the state level. Something that's easy to find, easy to use, that you know has been vetted against some kind of quality standard, whether for district use or in your classroom. The ability to collaborate in a personal learning network, something that you can do without fear of wondering where funding is coming from on an infrastructure level. Do you have the bandwidth to support some of the initiatives that you'd like to try? And then policies that are consistent, not only with the mission of your school, but on a bigger level as well. What I'd like to do at this point, I think, is turn things over to Barbara. Hopefully I left Barbara enough time to share all the wonderful things that are happening in Washington State. While she's speaking, I will be able to hopefully answer some questions, and then if anyone is tweeting, I'll be able to respond to that as well. So Barbara, whenever you're ready, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody, and thanks for spending a little of your St. Patrick's Day with us here to talk about OER. I've got my appropriately green tea in front of me, so I'm good to go. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Barbara Suits. I am the Open Educational Resources Program Manager with the state of Washington. I know that Amanda will be keeping her eye on the chat window, so we can certainly pause every once in a while to address any burning questions that come up. And I'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions as well. So we've certainly seen that there is a lot of interest in OER right now as states and districts are looking for core instructional materials that meet new learning standards and frameworks. The potential of OER in helping to address this need certainly did not go unnoticed by Washington State. In 2012, our legislature directed the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to create a collection of openly licensed courseware aligned with our state learning standards and to conduct an awareness campaign to inform school districts about these resources. OER bring a huge potential for maintaining up-to-date content and collaborating within the building, the district, or with other districts on the continual quality improvement of that content, since they allow and encourage adaptation. Because they're free to distribute, They have the potential of shifting funds from content purchases to other critical areas of need, like professional development or increasing technology capacity at schools. And importantly, they let you do this legally without violating anyone's copyright, which in today's internet age, as we all know, is an increasingly easy thing to do. So here's one of my favorite examples of the power of open resources. The Southern Regional Education Board created a high school course to help students transition into post-secondary study. It's called Math Ready. The goal here was to really help students who had not been able to reach college and career readiness level with traditional core classes. So fast forward to last year when Washington passed legislation directing OSPI to work with higher ed to create bridge to college courses for math and ELA that really had similar goals. Since the Math Ready curriculum was openly licensed, we were able to use that as a very solid base and adapt it to the specific needs of our stakeholders, saving a tremendous amount of time and effort. So when we started on this work, the first thing we did was to survey our stakeholders across the state to get a real good pulse on the levels of awareness of OER and take stock of, those hopes and questions and concerns that were floating out there. Folks definitely recognized the benefits of OER, but along with all the potential, there were several issues that popped up consistently as barriers when we spoke with educators about the use and adoption of open resources. Obviously, I don't expect you to read all these right now. Suffice it to say, there were a lot of questions, and they really seemed to fall into 4 general areas. The first concern was how to locate OER. Not just one-off lessons or piecemeal activities, but how do you effectively find those more meaty units and full course material that fits your specific needs in an overwhelming digital universe where it oftentimes seems like you are drinking from a fire hose? Next were questions about quality. How do you know the resources you find are actually aligned to standards and are effective teaching tools? They're free, but are they good? Third were questions about equity of access. We all know that a lot of the cost-shifting potential of OER really depends on digital delivery of the content, but what about schools where that is just not a reality yet? And lastly, there were concerns about school board policies that didn't recognize OER as an option to consider for materials adoption. We crafted our OER project to address each of those concerns, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but first, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Before you start jumping in and picking out exciting new open resources, it's really important for districts to clarify their needs and expectations. In this chart, what we're suggesting is an alternative to the traditional 7-year adoption cycle, framing it as much more of a frequent iterative process. Before selecting any instructional materials, open or otherwise, it's really critical that district teams reflect on their learning goals and take into account their existing parameters, weighing that against how well current materials are meeting those goals. The delta between where districts are currently and where they would like to be should be the driving factor in determining what type of instructional materials to select. Maybe you only need a curriculum refresh or to fill gaps in existing materials. You could be one of the lucky districts. In that case, you might be looking for supplemental resources. On the other hand, maybe your core materials need a complete overhaul, in which case you'd be looking for comprehensive full course materials. I'll speak on behalf of Amanda here as well, but I certainly hope that once all of that pre-work has been done, you bring OER into the discussion as a potential option to consider. So, that said, where do you go to find open resources? In the next couple of slides, I'll call out a few places to start your search. I'm not going to go into each of these in depth, but links to all the sites that I'll mention are embedded in the slide deck. So if you download that at a later date, you'll have access to all of those links, and you can certainly explore them at your leisure. So I'll tell you right off the bat that this is not the best way to look for open resources, but I know we all do it, so I'll mention it right away. If you have to Google or Bing or Yahoo or in search engine of choice into that sentence, please use the advanced search features that allow you to filter results by license type, and they all have this option. That way you can winnow down the results quite a bit, and it won't be quite so overwhelming. A much better way to search, if you're not familiar with specific OER developers that you'd like to go and visit, is to use an OER repository or repository. Each of the sites on this screen here offer filters where you can search and dive down into specific content areas, grade bands, or materials types. OER Commons even offers built-in review tools over and above crowdsourcing rating systems. There are 3 sites here among many, and there are more coming online all the time. So what I've got here is by no means an exhaustive list, but here are a few places that you might want to search if you're looking for supplemental materials. The Library of Congress has excellent lessons and units for social studies, and certainly primary source documents. PhET for science simulations and associated teacher lessons, and Achieve the Core for math and ELA materials, as well as PD guidance. They've got a great blog called Aligned, which has tons of really great information that you might want to look for. The OER movement has deeper roots in the higher education space, with many courses offering open textbooks alternatives. And this is definitely now spreading into K12, and we're seeing several options for full course OER. By now, most of you have probably heard of Engage New York. This site from the New York Department of Education offers open curriculum for both math and ELA across the K12 spectrum. You can download PDF or even better editable Word document formats so you can adjust to suit the needs of your students. CK12 is a nonprofit organization that's focused on providing both full course textbooks and modular learning concepts, and those include things like simulations, readings, activities, and assessments. And I'm looking at the screen now and I'm seeing it's really fuzzy. Sorry for the non-clear slides. The majority of the materials at CK12 do fall into that 6 to 12 grade range in STEM content areas. I'm seeing some other great OER sources popping up in the chat window as well. The Utah Department of Education is one organization that has used CK12, among other resources, as a platform to build their own open textbooks in science for grades 3 through high school. In math, they have full course curriculum, both for middle school and high school level students, and all of these are available on the website that you'll be able to access when you link onto that Utah Open Textbooks at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. When you get the downloadable slide deck, obviously you can't click on it now. So open resources are not inherently good, bad, or aligned to learning standards. They are an option when you're considering instructional materials. And they should be considered in the same way that you would consider any other materials. At OSPI, we decided to tackle this quality issue question that we were seeing by reviewing OER using nationally recognized instruments, the same as you would review any traditional instructional material. The goal is really to provide districts with a consumer report style guide to OER so that they can make informed decisions about the instructional material. The advantage of using existing rubrics to review OER is that it better positions us to share results. If you're going to share information effectively between buildings and districts or states, you really have to speak a common language and have a shared vision of what quality looks like. So these are the tools that we used in our review process. The Instructional Materials Evaluation Tool, or IMET, from Student Achievement Partners, is a resource that's used to evaluate a comprehensive textbook or series. There's separate versions for use with ELA literacy materials for grades K2 or for grades 3-12. And there's also another set of 2 for math, one in the K8 range and one for high school. The Equip rubric from Achieve is used to evaluate lessons and units for math, ELA, and now science. It looks at 4 different dimensions of quality: alignment to standards, key instructional shifts, instructional supports, and assessments. And the Achieve OER rubrics are actually a suite of 8 different rubrics that were designed to be modular in nature. You only use the ones that are appropriate for the resource that you're looking at. For instance, some rubrics specifically look at technological interactivity. These are great tools for evaluating resources that are smaller in grain size than units or lessons, and they can be used with material in any content area. Currently, on our reviewed OER site, we have 24 math curricula and 60 ELA unit reviews that are posted. And I certainly encourage you to go take a look. Reviewers have provided great feedback as to the strengths and challenges of each of these resources. And as these are open resources, educators can actually take action on the actionable feedback that they've provided and make changes to bring them into tighter alignment. You can review these results online, or for those of you that would like to kick it old school, there are downloadable PDF reports for all 3 of the review cycles that we've done. And we have looked at materials in the middle school to high school range, and we certainly hope to be expanding that to elementary level next year. So this is really important. When you're building your review team, stakeholders from different departments in your district need to be at the table. In addition to curriculum and content experts looking at the review tools I just mentioned, you also need administrators to discuss things like approval pathways and professional learning options, to determine if print options are necessary and other implementation requirements. Since so much of our content nowadays is digital, technology specialists also need to be there to discuss delivery options, accessibility, what editing capabilities are there, and certainly any infrastructure concerns and concerns about bandwidth. School board policy issues were frequently cited as one of the biggest barriers to pursuing OER options. However, when you dug a little deeper, the problem with existing policies wasn't really OER. The problem was just outdated policy that failed to acknowledge that instructional materials have moved into the 21st century and are no longer limited to just textbooks. Instead, you have this whole new ecosystem of materials that are available in digital as well as print formats, and they're available under many different license types. The question then really becomes not how do you deal with OER, but how do you deal with this whole new landscape of potential options? Using examples from many of our forward-thinking districts, we worked with our State School Directors Association to craft a model policy that groups materials into 5 different categories and recognizes that each of these categories has different needs in terms of selection, vetting for quality, and responsibility for approval. And that's regardless of delivery platform or license type. This model policy was released in April, and districts are free to take it and adapt it to suit their own local needs. Okay, take a moment, pause for a deep breath. There's a lot to think about here, and it can get confusing when thinking about implementing OER at scale throughout a district. Much of the Washington OER Project's efforts lately have really been focused on how we can best support and be thought partners for districts that are thinking about using or are currently implementing OER. And I'll certainly talk about some of the work that's going on with the district. But before I do that, Amanda, were there any questions popping up in the chat window that we need to pause and take a moment to address?
Hi, Barbara. Thank you. We just got a really good question about district-level curation of OER for teachers. So I'm posting a few links that I think might be relevant, and I think that's something that you can speak to as well.
And I'm sorry, what was the specific question about district-level review, or are any districts doing that work?
Yes, whether districts are curating OER at a more centralized level as opposed to at a state level.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the goal for our project. We're not planning on being in the OER review business forever. The goal was really to create a model process that districts could take to review materials. And I think it's important to note that this is the same process that you would use for any instructional materials. It's not just an OER review process. These are the same tools that we are recommending to districts throughout the state. When they're looking at anything, these are great tools for really sussing out whether materials are going to meet your needs in both the full comprehensive course level as well as the supplemental materials level. It's just certainly our hope that OER is put into that pool of resources that are being considered as well. I know one of the ideas that's been thrown around a lot, and we certainly are in full support of that, is more and more districts that are sharing their reviewed OER results so that we don't all need to necessarily do exactly the same review over and over again, but the potential for districts that are, you know, nearby regionally sharing that information is certainly very exciting and something that we're pursuing. So let's talk a little bit about how districts are collaborating together. One strategy that seems to be working well is helping to create OER user groups. As more districts are developing their own OER core instructional material or implementing open resources, the need to share ideas and define best practices, champion effective distribution and implementation of resources is critical. Each of the user groups I'll mention here in a second is organized around a specific problem of practice. One of our user groups is centered around Engage New York Mathematics. We have had a great deal of uptake in districts throughout our state of the Engage New York math curriculum, or the Eureka math curriculum, which is based on Engage New York. This group here is dedicated to sharing resources across districts that are using the materials. Not to adapt the materials themselves as much as to provide strategies and resources that promote effective implementation. Things like communication tools or professional development resources, materials lists, pacing suggestions. Those are the kind of resources that are being put into this platform. Another group is focused on small school collaboration. Of Washington State's 295 school districts, 2/3 have 2,000 or fewer students. So this is really a very relevant question for us. This particular group convenes monthly to select and review resources. Then they go back to their respective classrooms in different geographical areas to implement the resource and then reflect and adapt upon reconvening. They've created a group on OER Commons, and they're pulling together a pool of resources that can be shared with the educational community. Three years ago, Grandview School District set about developing their own curriculum since they couldn't find materials that met their district needs. They have put a tremendous amount of time and effort into this project, and teacher professional learning doing development and implementation of this work has been key. The OER project is currently working with them now to make sure that all the correct open licensing is in place, and soon it will be released wide scale. Another great project that I don't have a slide for is a group of teachers that is meeting from across the state to create an equipped rubric for the social studies area. We have ELA and math and the science, but I have been disconnected from the conference. Let's see. Hold on. Can you guys still hear me? If you can hear me in the chat room, could somebody say something? Hello?
We still hear you.
Amanda, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, folks. I'm getting these notes that pop up on my screen that saying I was disconnected. Interesting. We're just going to hit cancel and keep going. Anyway, as I was saying, the group that's meeting now is really taking a look at some existing adaptations of that equipped rubric from other states and pulling together one that is specific to Washington for our learning standards that really takes the new C3 framework for social studies into account as well. So we anticipate that being available for folks to take a look at in May. In addition to supporting OER user groups, we run OER summits at least twice a year, pulling together regional districts who are starting to get serious about implementing OER. Teams that represent technology, curriculum, and administration are convened in a smaller setting to have really rich cross-district discussions on how to tackle the nuts and bolts of implementation. These are designed to take OER from the, hey, that sounds like a great idea stage, into here's what we're actually going to need to do to make this be successful stage. The summits have been important in highlighting those key questions that districts need to consider when thinking about implementing OER. They're also great showcases for regional districts who are leading efforts in the area and really walking the talk. Let's move out of Washington for a minute and take a peek at what else is going on in the K12 OER space. On the horizon, the K12 OER Collaborative is a nonprofit organization with the goal of creating full-course, educator-vetted, and standards-aligned OER, supporting math and English language arts. This is a really exciting project, and core instructional materials in middle school math are currently under development. For any math people in the audience, I think you'll be really happy to hear that Illustrative Mathematics is the developer of the math curriculum, and the 6th grade materials will be available to pilot in the 2016-17 school year, and you can access their website for more information about the project. Washington is certainly not alone in efforts to support OER. States like Utah and New York, Georgia, and North Carolina are just a few that are really helping push this forward. My apologies to any states I didn't just mention, because there is a ton of great work that's going on out there, and I could easily spout off many more. But what I do want to point out is both the Council for Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, in partnership with INACOL, and the State Ed Tech Directors Association have both done a really nice job of pulling together stories of OER in action, where districts have shared their journey. These sites do a really great job of capturing the lessons learned, and they're well worth your time to take a look at. At the national level, the Go Open campaign has been launched, which is encouraging districts and states to use openly licensed materials. I think I just saw a press release come across my email this morning that said 40 schools have taken the pledge or whatever the process they needed to go through to do that, to say that they'll be replacing one textbook currently with openly licensed materials. The Department of Ed has also announced that a proposed rulemaking change is in progress that would require that all materials created with Department of Ed competitive grant dollars have an open license on them. That means that work that's been funded by public taxpayer dollars would be freely available to the public, and that would be an exciting rulemaking change, and it's currently under consideration. So before we open it up for questions for both Amanda and I, just a couple of important takeaways from today. In your district, be sure to bring OER into your instructional materials selection process, discussing both the benefits and the considerations, and just really making sure that districts are well informed about both. Think deeply about your district needs. Identify the available review instruments and leverage existing OER reviews to help in choosing resources. And lastly, read some of the existing stories on OER implementations and take advantage of those lessons learned. They are hard-won, inspiring, and definitely worth your time. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Amanda, if you've been following, or Natalie, if you want to throw some questions out there that we can tackle, now would be a good time.
Hi, this is Amanda. I know I had seen a very good question come in a few minutes ago about copyright and LMS use with OER, whether that there would be an issue using OER in a learning management system. I did put an answer into the chat box, but Barbara, I just wanted to call that question to your attention in case you had any experience with using open educational resources within a learning management system and any considerations that might need to be taken into account there.
You know, if they are truly open educational resources, then there shouldn't be any issue with using them in a learning management system. I think where you run into issues is when you're using resources that are in that free but not necessarily open category. If it's a true open resource, you are well within your rights to download it and keep it on your server or put it in your LMS. Again, where it becomes an issue is if it's a resource folks have found on the internet that is free for viewing online, but you do not have the level of permission that's required to actually capture that resource and redistribute it. Sometimes there are issues with resources that have links to other resources that aren't necessarily open, and that's certainly something that needs to be considered in any kind of policy when you're loading up material into your LMS.
Just to piggyback off of what Barbara said, I will relay a point from Clark County School District, and I believe I posted the link to their case study. But I thought this was very practical and relevant for all of us who use a combination of different sources. It's unlikely that anyone would use all OER, although that happens. But for a lot of us, we're going to be using a mixture of some OER, maybe some traditional instructional materials, and then also there may be some premium services tacked on there as well. So it could be a service that provides educator videos or something like that. And in Clark County, one of the lessons that they have learned when they're building their online courses is if they would like to share those courses with another district, that is not always possible because what they're creating may include links to something like Discovery Education, which of course is a subscription-based service. And it's always important just to make sure that you know where you eventually want that lesson or that project to go, or if it's an online course especially. And that's something that they've learned throughout their process over the last few years.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that as well, what we're certainly discovering, and this is the case with one of our user groups that's essentially retroactively going back to the curriculum that they've created, and just cleaning up all of those issues where something wasn't actually openly licensed, or it did jump out to a link that wasn't open. It's a lot of work to do that retroactively. So as much thought can be given to that ahead of time, and as much help in really helping people think through all of the different license types and how they remix with each other. If you can do that in advance, it's well worth the time spent in training folks that are pulling together open resources.
I saw a question come in from Sarah about using OER and openly licensed resources at a for-profit institution. And what I would say, and please feel free to correct me, is there are definitely licenses you can look for, such as the Attribution 4.0 International. It's CC 4.0, which actually lets you adapt a resource for any purpose, even commercially. So even in that way, you still should be able to find OER that works for you. Again, I just think the first step for me was to really continuously make sure that I was checking back with maybe creativecommons.org so that I could understand the different license types. But yes, I would say there would still be plenty of OER available.
Yeah, what you want to look out for is the open licenses that have a non-commercial clause on them. So when you see that NC on the icon, that's an indicator that the resource is not intended for commercial reuse, so you have to be careful with that. As much as possible, we suggest that folks use the CCBY license, the attribution only license. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one is that it makes remixing materials much, much easier. There are 6 different flavors of Creative Commons license, and what we're finding is that when you try and remix, not all those licenses play nicely with each other, and they can create some really confusing conflicts. So to the extent that it's possible, if folks can apply the CC BY license to resources that they're creating, it just really makes it much, much easier and more flexible for downstream users that are going to be remixing those objects.
Were there any other questions or maybe even experiences with OER that you would like to share for anyone in the audience, people who have maybe had some experiences trying to find OER, ran into some challenges, or success stories where you found something that you thought really worked for you?
As folks are thinking about that a little bit, let me just throw in a consideration that I hope you're taking into account, and that's creating a policy within your district for a couple of things. One is really clarifying within your district who owns copyright on teacher created materials. It's the case that only the copyright holder can apply an open license, and so that becomes a really important thing to know when you're trying to openly license resources. I think in most of the districts that we work with, they're work for hire, essentially, so staff that's creating materials in the course of their work with the district are actually district-owned copyright. And in some cases that is different, but it's nice to know what that policy is ahead of time and who actually needs to give final permission for putting that open license on the work. And also, if your district can consider having an open policy so that all materials that are created by the district or by employees of the district are automatically openly licensed upon their inception, that will make it much, much easier for folks, in the rest of the ecosystem to be able to take advantage of that work and improve it and redistribute it out to others. I'm seeing a really long comment here. I'm just reading through the question. I think it's just a great link to the resources.
I'll chime in with something that I've heard from several educators and then also district leaders about OER, and the word that comes up often is grassroots, as in it really takes the motivation and the concerted effort of one person or maybe a small team that says, we're going to do this, we're going to determine what we want to do with this OER, how we want it to work, the purpose behind it, of course, and then little by little, people start realizing what's happening. Stakeholders, parents start understanding what these materials can offer as opposed to a more traditional static resource, and things may take off in a new direction from there. So if you are an educator and you have been either cultivating and curating some resources or you are using something, it seems to be common, at least with the people that I've been lucky enough to talk to, that they were able to stick with it and really get through some of those initial barriers to determine exactly what they could do with that OER, and they're really happy that they did. So that's in some of the CCSSO case studies that I know were included on one of Barbara's slides. But I think those stories are really important because they illustrate the perseverance of a classroom teacher to find something that they believe in and stick with it.
Well, Amanda, if there are no other questions, I think we should probably wrap it up. I do hope that if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Amanda or myself, and we'll be more than happy to answer those. I do hope you spend a little bit of time on the website that we have presented today, and hopefully it'll be a good discussion starter for you and your district on considering open educational resources.
Thank you, Barbara and Amanda, so much. It was a wonderful webinar. And you can find the webinar recorded and archived on the inacol.org website within 24 to 48 hours. And if you're interested in finding more webinars, we have 3 set up for April, so you can head to the inacol.org website and go to events, and you can sign up for those there. And Richard, to answer your question, yes, the presentation will be made available, both the recording and the downloadable PowerPoint, so you can have access to both of those. So a huge thank you to Barbara and Amanda. Thank you all for attending tonight's webinar, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.